They fired 18-inch shells. We had 5-inch hope. I watched through the smoke as the massive projectiles from the Japanese battleship Yamato screamed overhead like freight trains, each one weighing as much as a small car. The water erupted in towering geysers around our little escort carrier White Plains, close enough that the spray soaked our flight deck, close enough that I could taste the salt and cordite in the air, close enough that death was measuring the distance in yards, not miles. I'm about to tell you is the story of the most lopsided naval battle in history, and somehow, impossibly, we were on the winning side. But let me back up 6 hours to when this nightmare began. The morning had started like any other off the coast of Samar in the Philippines. Our task unit, call sign Taffy 3, was made up of 6 escort carriers and 7 destroyers, what we called a Jeep carrier group. We weren't built for fighting battleships. Hell, we weren't built for fighting much of anything. Our job was to provide air support for the troops landing on Leyte ferry planes around and stay out of harm's way. I was in the island superstructure of the White Plains, drinking coffee fattisted like it had been brewed in a boiler room, when the radio crackled to life at 0645 hours. All stations, this is Lone Wolf. Enemy surface units bearing north, distance 20 miles, closing fast. Estimate 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, numerous destroyers. The coffee cup slipped from my hands and shattered on the deck. 4 battleships? That couldn't be right. Intelligence had told us that Admiral Halsey's Task Force 34 was guarding San Bernardino Strait. The Japanese fleet wasn't supposed to be here, but they were. Captain Dennis Sullivan's voice boomed over the ship's intercom. General quarters. General quarters. All hands to battle stations. This is not a drill. The klaxon's urgent wail sent men scrambling across the deck. I grabbed my helmet and life jacket, my mind racing. We had maybe 28 aircraft spread across our 6 carriers, mostly slow, lightly armed Wildcats and Avengers. They had the most powerful battleships ever built. As I ran toward my battle station, I caught sight of our escorts wheeling around to form a protective screen. The destroyer Johnston was already belching black smoke as her engines pushed her to flank speed. Behind her, the Hoel and Heermann were following suit. Those tin cans were about to charge into the guns of battleships. It was either the bravest or most foolish thing I'd ever seen, probably both. By 0700 hours, the Japanese fleet was close enough that we could see their pagoda masts on the horizon. Admiral Takeo Kurita had brought the cream of the Imperial Navy through San Bernardino Strait. The super-battleships Yamato and Nagato, heavy cruisers Chikuma, Tone, Haguro, and Chokai, and a screen of destroyers. Against our 6 little escort carriers and 7 destroyers. On paper, it wasn't even a contest. The Yamato alone displaced more than our entire task unit combined. Her 18.1-inch guns could punch through 3 feet of steel armor. Our biggest guns were the 5-inch 38 caliber mounts on our destroyers, Pichoters against Titans. But numbers on paper don't account for the human heart. Admiral Clifton Ziggy Sprague, commanding Taffy 3 from the carrier Fanshawe Bay, made the only decision he could: run south toward Leyte Gulf and hope that Admiral Kincaid's battleships could come to our rescue. In the meantime, our aircraft would do whatever they could to slow down the Japanese fleet. I was coordinating the airstrikes from our Combat Information Center when the first salvo from the Japanese heavy cruisers bracketed us. The White Plains shuddered as near misses sent columns of water cascading over our flight deck. Through Theppertol, I could see our Wildcats launching one after another, their pilots knowing they were flying into hell with popguns. Lieutenant Bobby Chen, one of our squadron leaders, keyed his radio as his F-4F climbed away from the deck. Scratch 1 carrier pilot. Add 1 torpedo bomber. We're going in dry. He meant it literally. Half our planes were launching without torpedoes or bombs. There hadn't been time to arm them all. Some of our pilots were making attack runs with nothing but their 50 caliber machine guns, hoping to distract the Japanese gunners long enough for our ships to escape. It was magnificent and heartbreaking at the same time. While our aircraft swarmed toward the Japanese fleet like angry bees, our destroyer escorts began their own impossible charge. From the CIC, I could hear the radio chatter from the Johnston as Commander Ernest Evans ordered his ship into the teeth of the enemy formation. All ahead flank. Come left to course 090. We're going to take on that lead cruiser. The Johnston was 2,100 tons of American steel and determination, racing toward the 13,000-ton heavy cruiser Yamato. It should have been suicide. Instead, it was poetry. Through my binoculars, I watched the Johnston disappear into her own smokescreen, then emerge like a ghost ship firing everything she had. Her 5-inch guns were pumping out rounds as fast as the crews could load them. Orange flames licked from her barrels as she closed the range to point blank. Then she launched her torpedoes. I held my breath as the white wakes streaked through the water. The range was less than 6,000 yards, close enough to see the shock on the faces of the Japanese sailors. One torpedo, then two, then three slammed into the Yamato's bow. The heavy cruiser lurched to a stop, her forward magazines exploding in a pillar of fire and smoke. Muttered Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, our radar operator. The Johnston just stopped a heavy cruiser with a tin can, but the Johnston wasn't finished. Even as Japanese shells began to find their range, Commander Evans swung his ship around and charged the next target in line, the heavy cruiser Suzuya. Behind him, the Hoel and Heermann were following his lead, their guns blazing defiance at ships 10 times their size. It was the most beautiful, terrible thing I'd ever witnessed. By 8 o'clock hours, the Japanese had closed to within 20,000 yards, and the Yamato had opened fire with her main battery. The first salvo fell short, sending up waterspouts that towered 400 feet into the air. The second salvo was long, passing over us with a sound like ripping canvas magnified 1,000 times. The third salvo straddled us. The White Plains bucked like a wild horse as 18.1-inch shells exploded in the water around us. Each explosion sent a shock wave through the ship that rattled my teeth and made my ears ring. In the CIC, instrument panels sparked and went dark. The lights flickered. Somewhere below, I could hear the sound of breaking glass and shouting voices. Captain Sullivan was conning the ship from the bridge, weaving through the shell splashes like a quarterback dodging tackles. His voice on the intercom was steady, almost conversational. Left full rudder. All ahead flank. Let's see if we can make these bastards work for their breakfast. But I knew we couldn't dodge forever. The Japanese had too many guns, too much firepower. It was only a matter of time before one of those massive shells found its mark. That's when our lone 5-inch gun entered the battle. The White Plains wasn't supposed to be a warship. She was a converted merchant hull built to ferry aircraft and stay out of trouble. Her only real armament was a single 5-inch/38 caliber gun mounted on her stern, a weapon so insignificant that most naval architects probably forgot to include it in their calculations. But Lieutenant Tom Hodges, our gunnery officer, had other ideas. I found him in the gun tub as the Japanese cruisers closed to within 15,000 yards, their 8-inch shells beginning to find our range. He was bent over the gun sight, his face streaked with sweat and smoke, calling out firing solutions to his crew. Range 14,000. Bearing 070. Target is the second cruiser in line. Load high explosive. The gun crew moved with practiced precision despite the chaos around them. The loader slammed a 54-pound shell into the breech while the powder man rammed home the propellant charge. The gun captain checked the firing solution one more time, then looked to Lieutenant Hodges. Battery ready. Fire! The 5-inch gun barked, sending its shell arcing across the water toward the heavy cruiser Chikuma. It was like David hurling a stone at Goliath, except David was standing on a burning ship, while Goliath had friends. Through my binoculars, I watched the shell splash harmlessly into the sea, several hundred yards short of the target. The Japanese cruiser continued on course, her guns swiveling toward us with mechanical precision. Muttered Lieutenant Hodges. Spot up 400. Same target. Again the gun fired. Again the shell fell short, though closer this time. The Japanese were finding their range too. Their next salvo landed close enough to spray the flight deck with steel fragments. But something was happening. The Chikuma's rate of fire was slowing. Her next salvo was ragged, poor-limed. I could see smoke beginning to rise from her superstructure. Sir, called out Seaman Martinez from the rangefinder, I think we got a hit on that last one. It seemed impossible. A 5-inch shell against a heavy cruiser was like throwing rocks at a tank. But Lieutenant Hodges was already calling for another round, and his crew was responding with the smooth efficiency of a machine. Same target. Fire for effect. The gun spoke again, and this time I saw the flash of the impact on the Chikuma's bridge. It wasn't enough to sink her, probably wasn't enough to seriously damage her, but it was enough to give her gunners something to think about. For the next hour, our little 5-inch gun dueled with Japanese heavy cruisers, firing as fast as the crew could load. We couldn't match their firepower, but we could make them respect us. Every shell we put in their direction was one more factor they had to consider, one more variable in their calculations. 5-inch hope, indeed. While we were trading punches with the Japanese surface fleet, our aircraft were performing miracles in the sky above. The pilots from all 6 carriers of Taffy 3 had formed up into impromptu attack groups, hitting the Japanese fleet with everything they had, and quite a few things they didn't. Lieutenant Bobby Chen's voice crackled over the radio as he led a flight of 4 Wildcats in a strafing run on the battleship Congo. No bombs, no torpedoes, no problem. We'll strafe the bastards to death if we have to. I watched through binoculars as the little fighters dove on the massive battleship there. 50 caliber machine guns sparkling like flashbulbs. It should have been futile, machine gun bullets bouncing off battleship armor like raindrops. But the Japanese anti-aircraft gunners didn't know that our planes were essentially unarmed. They threw up a wall of flak that forced the Congo to maneuver, disrupting her firing solution on our carriers. Other pilots were even more creative. Ensign Jensen, flying an Avenger torpedo bomber, had launched with no torpedo but discovered he still had a depth charge in his bomb bay, useless against surface ships, but the Japanese didn't know that. He made repeated mock attacks on the heavy cruiser Tone, forcing her to turn away each time to avoid the torpedo that never came. The most incredible story came from Lieutenant Joe McGraw, flying a damaged Wildcat with a jammed gun. Running low on fuel and out of ammunition, he spotted a Japanese destroyer that had separated from the main formation. Instead of heading back to the carrier, McGraw dove his fighter straight at the destroyer's bridge. The Japanese sailors must have thought was planning a kamikaze attack, because the entire ship opened fire with everything they had. But at the last second, McGraw pulled up, passing just feet over the destroyer's superstructure. The shock wave from his propeller was enough to knock several Japanese sailors overboard, and the psychological effect was even greater. He made 3 more passes before his fuel ran out, keeping an entire Japanese destroyer out of the fight with nothing but pure audacity. By 9 o'clock hours, the impossible was happening. The Japanese fleet, which should have steamrolled through our little task unit in 30 minutes, was falling into disorder. The heavy cruiser Choka was dead in the water, victim of a torpedo attack by the destroyer Hirman. The Chikuma was burning from multiple aircraft hits and the steady pounding from our 5-inch guns. The Suzuya had been knocked out of line by the Johnston's torpedoes. Most incredibly, the super-battleship Yamato was turning away. I couldn't believe what I was seeing through my binoculars. The most powerful warship ever built was retreating from a force of escort carriers and destroyers. Later, I would learn that Admiral Kurita had been convinced by our fierce resistance that he was facing Admiral Halsey's main fleet, not a small escort force. But we were paying a terrible price for our defiance. The destroyer Johnston was listing heavily to port, her forward gun silent, her superstructure a twisted wreck. Commander Evans was still on the bridge, still fighting his ship, but everyone could see she was doomed. The Hoel was in even worse shape. Multiple shell hits had knocked out her engines and steering. She was dead in the water, her crew abandoning ship even as her after guns continued to fire at the Japanese formation. The destroyer Escort Samuel B. Roberts, which we called the Sammy B, had made a torpedo attack that would have done credit to a heavy cruiser. But Japanese return fire had broken her back and she was settling by the stern. Our own casualties were mounting too. The White Plains had taken several hits from Japanese cruisers. The flight deck was cratered with shell holes, and fires burned in 3 different compartments. But our damage control teams were working miracles, keeping us afloat and operational. Then at 9:25 hours, everything changed. Admiral Kurita's voice came crackling across the radio intercept frequency, speaking in Japanese to his fleet commanders. Our intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Williams, translated in real time. All units, this is flagship. Break off action and withdraw to the north. Repeat, break off action and withdraw. I stared at the radio speaker, certain I had misunderstood. The Japanese were withdrawing. They had us dead to rights. A few more minutes and they could have sunk every ship in Taffy 3. Why were they running? The answer came from our pilots still circling the Japanese fleet. Ensign Peterson, flying reconnaissance in his damaged Wildcat, reported what he was seeing. The Japanese formation is scattered all over the ocean. They've got ships burning, ships dead in the water, ships heading in 6 different directions. It looks like they've had enough. That's when I understood what had happened. We hadn't won through superior firepower or better tactics. We had won through sheer, bloody-minded refusal to quit. Every torpedo attack by our destroyers, every strafing run by our fighters, every shell from our lone 5-inch gun had convinced the Japanese that they were facing a much larger force. Admiral Kurita, looking at his scattered fleet and mounting losses, had made the rational decision to withdraw. What he didn't know was that we were down to our last shells, our last gallons of fuel, our last ounce of strength. As the Japanese silhouettes disappeared over the northern horizon, a cheer went up from the White Plains. Men who had been certain they were going to die were hugging each other and laughing. In the gun tub, Lieutenant Hodges and his crew were slapping each other on the back, their 5-inch gun still smoking from its marathon duel with Japanese heavy cruisers. But the cheering died quickly as we began to count the cost. The destroyer Johnston was gone, taking Commander Ernest Evans and 185 of his crew with her. The Hoel had followed her to the bottom, along with 253 sailors. The destroyer Escort Samuel B. Roberts had sunk with the loss of 89 men, including her captain, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland. These weren't just numbers on a casualty report. They were men I had served with, laughed with, shared coffee with in the pre-dawn hours before battle. Commander Evans had been at the officers' club just 3 days earlier, telling stories about his Cherokee grandfather and his days at the Naval Academy. Lieutenant Commander Copeland had shown me pictures of his new daughter, born just 2 months before we deployed. Now they were gone, along with hundreds of others, victims of an impossible battle that we somehow won. But we had won. Against all odds, against all logic, Taffy 3 had defeated the most powerful surface fleet the Japanese Navy could muster. We had sunk 3 heavy cruisers, damaged several more ships, and forced the withdrawal of 4 battleships, including the mighty Yamato. More importantly, we had saved the late invasion. If Admiral Kurita's fleet had broken through to Leyte Gulf, they could have slaughtered the invasion transports and support ships. Thousands of American soldiers would have died, and the liberation of the Philippines would have been set back by months, maybe years. Instead, the Japanese fleet was limping back toward home waters, and General MacArthur's troops were secure in their beachheads. In the hours that followed, rescue ships arrived to pick up survivors from our sunken destroyers. The carriers of Taffy 3 began the grim task of accounting for our losses and damage. The White Plains had taken 6 hits from Japanese shells, but our damage control teams had her flight deck operational by noon. I spent the afternoon helping to coordinate search and rescue operations for downed pilots. Many of our aircrews had ditched in the ocean when their fuel ran out, and we were racing against time to find them before the sharks did. Lieutenant Bobby Chen was among the missing. His Wildcat had been hit by flak during his final strafing run on the Congo, and several pilots reported seeing him go down about 10 miles north of our position. We found him 3 hours later, floating in his life raft with a broken arm and a grin that stretched from ear to ear. "Did we get them?" were his first words as we hauled him onto our rescue boat. "We got them," I assured him. That evening, as the sun set over the waters off Samar, I stood on the flight deck of the White Plains and tried to make sense of what had happened. By every law of naval warfare, we should have been annihilated. The Japanese had overwhelming superiority in firepower, armor, and speed. They had every advantage except one. They didn't have the heart of the American sailor. I thought about Commander Evans, standing on the bridge of his burning destroyer, still fighting even as his ship went down. I thought about Lieutenant Hodges and his gun crew, trading shots with heavy cruisers from their single 5-inch mount. I thought about all the pilots who flew into battle with empty bomb bays and jam-engines, determined to do whatever they could to protect their shipmates. They had turned the laws of physics upside down through sheer force of will. As I write this account, 78 years have passed since the Battle off Samar. The White Plains was scrapped in 1946, her service complete. Most of the men who fought that day are gone now, taken by time instead of Japanese shells. But their story lives on, a testament to what ordinary people can accomplish when faced with extraordinary circumstances. We were supply clerks and mechanics, farm boys and city kids, welded together by training and tradition into something greater than the sum of our parts. The battle off Samar was the last great surface action of the Pacific War, and in many ways the most improbable. A handful of escort carriers and destroyers had defeated the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through courage, determination, and an absolute refusal to surrender. In the end, that's what won the war in the Pacific. Not the atomic bombs or the massive fleets or the strategic bombing campaigns, though all of those played their part. It was won by men like Commander Evans and Lieutenant Hodges and all the others who looked death in the face and said, "Not today." They fired 18-inch shells. We had 5-inch hope, and hope, it turned out, was enough. The Battle off Samar, fought on October 25, 1944, was the central action of the larger Battle of Leyte Gulf, the biggest naval engagement in history. Task Unit 77.4, 3 Taffy 3, consisting of 6 escort carriers and 7 destroyers, faced the Japanese center force of 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Despite being massively outgunned, Taffy 3 forced the Japanese to withdraw, saving the late invasion fleet. The action cost the lives of 1,583 American sailors, but prevented what could have been a catastrophic defeat. For their extraordinary heroism, the units of Taffy 3 received the Presidential Unit Citation, and many individual crew members were awarded the Navy Cross, Silver Star, and other decorations for valor. USS White Plains CVE-66 survived the war and was decommissioned in 1946. She had earned 5 battle stars for her service in the Pacific Theater, but her finest hour came on that October morning off Samar when her single 5-inch gun helped hold the line against impossible odds.